So frankincense comes from boswellia trees. And starting off with this beautiful image of a Boswellia sacra tree in Oman is just a nice shot of a tree to start with. But we're going to dive right in to showing you where frankincense trees grow. So you're looking at a map of the Horn of Africa, a little bit of the Middle East and India. And that's because this is where these are the predominant areas where frankincense grows. Different species grow in different locations, and so you might have gotten of essential oil of frankincense that smelled differently because it was a different species. It might have come from India, that's Boswellia serrata, or it might have come from the Horn of Africa here in Somalia, Somaliland, or Ethiopia, the three different species coming from there. And what you're seeing along the bottom are the five most commercially traded species. There's well over a dozen species of frankincense, but these are the most commonly traded ones. These trees are quite remarkable. They're able to produce hundreds of different phytochemicals, the terpenes being the most prevalent, and that's what you smell, those volatile terpenes, when you're smelling frankincense. But there's also heavy components, such as boswellic acids that are really sought after, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about the medicinal use of the boswellic acids in a few more slides. But there's new components and variations and profiles still being identified. We really still don't know the chemical ecology as to exactly why the trees are producing what they're producing, which is very fascinating scientifically. Is it something that the tree is defending itself from? We know that yes, it is, but exactly what it's doing, why it's doing it, and the synergistic effects are still something being studied. This is a Boswellia feriana frankincense tree. You see that growing right on the rock. They have this amazing adaptability to grow on rock. They can do this over time, balling up their roots and live without ever even getting their roots into soil. What a skill. These trees, they thrive in hot and dry areas where few other species can survive. It's a great strategy, see, because they have that rock all to themselves. The ecology of the trees, the areas where these trees grow are remarkably beautiful. They prefer arid climates, and as I said, growing on poor and rocky soils, and they also live off mists that come from the oceans, and that's quite a remarkable thing to see when the fogs come in. I believe I have a picture of that for you in a couple more slides. They're monoecious, which means they can self-pollinate, but it's a good strategy to cross-pollinate, and so they're pollinated by insects, and the fruits are woody and the seeds are wind dispersed. They're deciduous or semi-deciduous, dropping their leaves during the dry season as a strategy to retain moisture and to not dry out, and they leaf out during the rainy season. Ah, here's the mist. You can see the mist there on the left coming in. This is the Frankincense Trail following the limestone cliffs here in Somaliland. Here's just a glam shot of a beautiful frankincense Boswellia dalzielii in Burkina Faso on one of the research locations we've worked together on. So what is frankincense? Well, you're already starting to figure out that it comes from a tree, but it's the resinous exudate that comes out of the tree. It's the tree's immune system. It's its defense system. And within the tree's bark, there's resin channels where if it's broken, if a boring insect gets into the tree, if a branch falls off, that the resin will naturally exude to protect itself. As a physical barrier, like a Band-Aid, but also with the phytochemicals within the resins to protect itself from bacteria and fungi, etc. Tapping these trees for humans and getting at the resin for human use is really difficult work. It really the harvesters here's a someone harvesting. He's climbed up this tree to harvest it. They really do. You see in the left there. They really do risk life and limb to gather these resins for us humans to use, as we have been for over 6,000 years, using frankincense resins in many different capacities. But to do this, they have to go out there and tap the trees and do that over several months through several rotations to be able to collect these resins and bring them in for usually the women to sort, which I'll show you a picture of. Here's a picture of a wound. On the left, you can see two wounds, active tapping locations stacked on top of each other. And this close-up shows you something very interesting. This close-up is showing you here. Here's the active tap for collecting the resin, but here's an old tap that was done properly so that the tree could heal after the tapping. The tree is doing its natural process, and so if the trees are tapped properly, they will heal. They will be able to sustain being tapped. There's a beautiful shot of Boswellia feriana frankincense resin. It comes out in these long tiers. This is in Somalia. And we even compete with the bees because the bees like to eat the resin as well and bring it back to their hives. That was a little video. Um, Here's some resin after it's been harvested and brought in to the sorting stations. It's done in traditional ways in these straw-built huts that allow for them to stay out of the sun and to dry, but also stored in caves like this, and then brought into centers where the gender division in frankincense is usually that the men harvest and women sort. However, there are cases where women also are involved in collection of the resins, but predominantly they sort. And the last one was Somalia. This is in Ethiopia. And after the women do this painstaking work of cleaning out the rocks and the bark, here's what you're left with is beautiful resins. And here's some more beautiful shots of just the variation of different types of resins. So beautiful. So the traditional uses, you may yourself burn frankincense in an incense burner on those little charcoals. Its psychoactive properties are really well known, and they have been for thousands of years as an entheogen burned in spiritual and religious ceremonies to promote a spiritual mindset. But they're also used medicinally as tranquilizers and analgesics, also traditionally used in homes to fumigate bodies or clothing, to promote health or ward off, demons, evil spirits, depending on the cultural beliefs. In Egypt, for sure, they were burning frankincense in copious amounts. In Queen Hatshepsut's tomb, burning it 24/7 as an offering to the gods. So the spiritual and traditional uses of frankincense are many. Frankincense and myrrh also used as embalming, for embalming mummies. Here's an inscription from Queen Hatshepsut's tomb in Egypt, showing the harvesting of frankincense. The medicinal aspects and traditional uses, and still being used today in communities where frankincense is collected for gum health and toothaches and stomach aches. The resins are used to dress wounds and prevent hemorrhaging, used in in traditional Chinese medicine, currently still today. You could go into a pharmacy in China and buy frankincense products for arthritis, used in Ayurvedic and Islamic traditions and by doctors for its anti-inflammatory properties, used in the United States as well for the same purposes. Um, the essential oils and perfumes are what are so popular and have become so popular in the last 10 years or so, essential oils becoming very mainstreamed. Um, if you've ever smelled frankincense, it's very distinct, and used topically for skin health and anti-aging are two of the properties that it's looked for. But here's an extract. This is also another use in Western markets or around the world, and for osteoarthritis, rheumatoid arthritis, all kinds of different inflammatory conditions. So I just want to switch gears now a little bit. That was a crash course in frankincense. Um, to also bring light to the fact that there's a lot of human instability and conflict almost everywhere these trees grow. Part of that is because they grow on marginal lands that don't get a lot of water, where people are food insecure and water insecure. We see quite a lot of conflicts. And so the trees are caught in between human conflicts almost everywhere that they grow. And they're also, the trees are threatened by things like land conversion in places where people need to grow crops or put in agricultural things like sorghum here. That's what was being grown here, but also for deforestation in general. Um, and overtapping is something that we see quite commonly in many places where trees are being overtapped or improperly tapped by young or inexperienced tappers who are really trying to maximize resin yields and, in fact, actually causing decline in tree health, and often trees die from being overtapped like this. So these kind of practices, which I'm just going over really quickly, we could go into a lot more detail on that. Steve and I do a lot of work in this area. And so we have other talks where we go into lots of detail. But it's important to point out to you that frankincense trees really are in a category of high environmental risk. There's a lot of demand for the resin from a static population of trees. Majority, almost all of the resin is harvested from trees that grow in wild forests. This is not a case where these trees are being cultivated in farms or plantations. They're growing in the wild. So as a wild tree species, the demand really is something that it puts a lot of pressure on their health. The overharvesting, obviously being something, the climate change, putting more pressure on the trees, increased need for livelihoods for folks in places where populations are growing, and of course, lack of transparency and traceability in the supply chain. All of these things add up to a high environmental risk. But there's also challenges in the labor, in the supply chain, and often folks who are harvesting and sorting frankincense are some of the most marginalized people within their countries. The benefits are often diverted by middlemen. There's low and unstable prices for the collectors and sorters. We've seen cases where harvesters are paid in food rather than cash, and that often is not an equal exchange. There's little to no investment in many of the communities, and in many cases, just lacking basic safety equipment, with also limited access to healthcare. And so that creates high social risk as well. And just to kind of sum this up, these kind of impacts of unsustainable overharvesting and the labor risks, they really have an impact on people's well-being and on the culture and society in general, creating poverty, loss of cultural heritage and sense of place, displacement, and people having a reduced resiliency to climate change, and a lack of mistrust, a distrust of people, and growing animosity towards companies and governments and even NGOs. We've seen in certain places an increased cot addiction, which is a stimulant. It's a plant that's chewed in parts of Africa, and overall depression and hopelessness. So as we transition now, I'm going to stop my end of the slideshow. I'm going to pass it over to Stephen. We're going to get into some of the solutions and not just leave you with some of the tough parts of this, but also talk about solutions. So bear with us for a second while we change over our slides. I'm going to stop sharing mine. And Stephen, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Anjanette. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming today. My name is Stephen Johnson from Fair Source Botanicals. My company produces frankincense essential oils, among other products. And we source these resins and materials from various countries and have done for the last few years. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the structure of the supply chain, how the sourcing works, and how we can increasingly push these supply chains towards ethical and responsible behavior being the norm. So first of all, I want to take you through the traditional structure of the supply chain. And this is a structure that still exists today. This is the normal way the supply chain operates. You have harvesters who are collecting resin in wild areas. There are some experimental plantations, but even today, there are really no commercially viable plantations. So all the resin is collected from the wild. Harvesters work in small teams, 2 to 10 people. And once they get the resin off the tree, they dry it in a cave or hut in the harvesting site, and then they bring it to a village where they put it in a storeroom. And this is the first link in the chain. Typically, they're selling it to this storeroom owner or this shopkeeper who sells it to an intermediate trader or broker. This person sells it to a regional trader with warehouses in the regional capitals. They in turn might send it for sorting, where the resin is graded based on the size and color of the pieces, where the bark is removed, or they might just sell it directly to an exporter who operates on a national level and sells the resin on to companies internationally who typically distill it or process it into other products, and who are then in turn going to sell to other wholesalers, formulators, manufacturers, or directly to retailers who are going to sell products made with frankincense, including just bottles of frankincense oil. Now, I want to highlight a couple of key things here. First, as you move down the supply chain from the harvesters to the ultimate retailers, what we see is increasing value at every step. So each trader that is involved, or every link in the chain, adds their price onto the frankincense. So it gets more and more valuable as it goes along. But we see more people at the base of the supply chain. It takes a ton of harvesters to collect all of this resin, but only a few traders in the middle to be able to move it around. So as we go down the chain from the original harvesters further and further away to international markets, we see dramatically increasing value, but we still see the bulk of people operating at the very beginning. And it's important to remember that these supply chains are very complex. There is this high disparity, and they're also very opaque. It's very hard to see past one link in the chain. For any given bag of resin or bottle of oil, where did it come from? Typically, the different actors in the supply chain don't share information with each other about where they got the material from, because they're making money off of their position in the supply chain. So the end result is that companies that are formulating with frankincense or that are putting together products to sell to consumers often have a very difficult time identifying where specifically the resins came from, which harvesting areas, which harvesters were involved. They might have a rough idea of villages or regions, but it's very rare to be able to connect a batch of resin with specific harvesting areas. So there's this block in between caused by this opacity. Now, how much resin is actually traded annually? The trade data is a little bit difficult. It's often unreliable, and the trade codes that track what kind of materials move around include frankincense with a bunch of other types of resins. So it's a little bit difficult to know for sure how much material is traded. We think that there's about 10 to 15,000 tons of frankincense that are traded internationally annually, and that number is increasing. And we see Ethiopia, Somalia, and Sudan as the major suppliers, but there are dozens of countries that are involved in this trade. The total value of this, once it gets to a retail level, is very difficult to estimate, but it's probably at least worth $1 billion or more. So this is a very significant trade. And if we assume that about 15,000 tons of resin are being used, this implies about 30 million frankincense trees are being harvested. So there's a lot of people involved, there's a lot of resin involved, a lot of trees, and a lot of money ultimately. Now, I want to highlight the case of the financial disparity here. Despite how valuable this trade can be, it's not necessarily all that lucrative for harvesters on the ground. Now, this is a very common thing for a lot of wild harvested botanicals. This is not unique to frankincense, but it definitely is at play in frankincense. Harvesters typically receive as little as 1 to 2% of the final retail price of the frankincense product. Sometimes it's even less than that. And if you look at the average price of, say, a 10 milliliter bottle of frankincense oil, it's around 20, maybe $25. Some companies sell it for a lot more, but generally speaking, it's around that price. Now, if you just added 50 cents onto that price, so instead of $20, you paid $20.50, at that 50 cents represents an additional $3.45 per kilo of resin. So for most consumers, they're not really going to notice the difference between 19 and 1950 or 22 and 2250, right? But if you could take that 50 cents and you could guarantee that it went to the harvesters themselves, that's a massive difference in what they're getting paid and a massive difference in what kind of community investments can be developed. So it's life-changing for harvesters, but not too big of a difference on the retail consumer side because of the high disparity. But this only works if you have the transparency to ensure the money gets where it needs to go. Remember, there's a lot of links in the chain, and it's often difficult for the retail end to be able to see who the original harvesters are. If you're a company that's selling frankincense products and you want to add an additional 50 cents and give it back to the harvesters, what do? Do you just pay your supplier more? Well, how do you know that it's not just padding their bottom line or going to some broker or middle trader? How do you know that it's actually going to the harvesters? And this is where we need better transparency to be able to access that kind of strategy, where minor differences on the retail end can have life-changing impacts at the base of the supply chain. Now, these challenges that we see here very commonly include environmental challenges. As I said, we see increasing demand for frankincense resin, but we still see the same number of trees, right? The population of the trees isn't increasing. So it means that more and more resin is being demanded from the same number of trees. This can lead to overharvesting and unsustainable management of frankincense populations. And this pressure can be compounded by climate change. So changing rainfall patterns, increased incidence of extreme weather events like cyclones that have become more common in recent years. We also see social concerns. Very often, the prices paid to harvesters are very, very low because we see middlemen that are making their money and middle traders that are making their money at the expense of the harvesters. They're paying them less so they can have margin for themselves. The markets are also unstable. Most harvesting communities do not receive multi-year contracts. They might sell to a different trader every year, so they don't necessarily have continuity to know that their resin is going to be able to be sold year to year and that they're going to get a fair price for it. And they also have very little access to services. So in many harvesting communities are isolated and in very rural areas. They don't necessarily have access to healthcare or clean water. Many are food insecure. So there are communities that can really benefit from additional investment and additional projects, but the supply chain is not facilitating that. Now the question is, if you're a company that is using frankincense products, say in the United States or Europe, Australia, wherever, if you're a brand, should you invest in sustainability? Does it make a difference? Should you care about what's happening earlier in the supply chain? Well, if we look at it, there are some benefits to this. First of all, a number of companies have gotten enhanced marketing and product value from being able to talk about their sourcing stories and show that they are doing things ethically. Companies that are showing that they have values that match their consumers' values often have improved relationships with their customer base and improved loyalty because customers want to feel like they're supporting something positive in the world. Just on a practical level, it has also helped a number of companies to obtain the necessary harvest and export permissions to make the supply chain run smoothly. So there are a number of positive benefits associated with investing in responsible sourcing. On the other hand, there is also a stick component to this. Companies can benefit from responsible sourcing by reducing the risk to them in their supply chains. We've seen in recent history that opaque supply chains have made life difficult for companies that rely on those products. For instance, in Ethiopia, the coffee sector was thrown into disarray because there's so many smallholder farmers that are producing coffee, but there isn't that traceability. And when the EU deforestation regulation began to take force, the coffee sector was really struggling to try to show that they could meet this regulation. And so there was a major block to trade there. We've also seen regulatory complications result in painful fines or products being blocked. And of course, there is good old-fashioned shaming in the media. Companies that get caught doing, negative things or supporting negative practices in the supply chain can find themselves facing a PR disaster. So this was seen, for instance, in cacao in West Africa, when multiple reports showed that there was a significant amount of child labor and forced labor taking place there. So companies also have an incentive to avoid supply chain disruptions, regulatory complications, and potential PR crises by investing in this responsible sourcing. So everybody should be benefit, right? The harvesting community should benefit. The end using companies, the retailers, the formulators, the brands that are actually using this should benefit. Few middlemen in the middle don't. But hey, vast majority of the people in the supply chain should see positive benefit for this. So the question is, how do we get there? My company's central thesis here is that in order to achieve this responsible sourcing dream, it's a pretty straightforward series of events. We need full transparency through the supply chain. We need to be able to see where the products are coming from, where the resin is coming from at every step. We need to know which trees were harvested. We need to know who was doing the harvesting. We need to know the communities. We need to have that full transparency so that we can see what's going on. That transparency creates accountability because when we know what's going on, we can take responsibility for it. And that gives us the opportunity to take positive action. We can support practices that are already yielding positive results and they're doing good things. And we can identify where the challenges are. It shouldn't be a shameful thing to acknowledge that supply chains are complicated and they have challenges, right? Every supply chain on earth has something that could be improved about it. But if we try to pretend that there's nothing wrong, that there's nothing that could be improved, we rob ourselves of the opportunity to create positive change and create positive action. So having that transparency is really critical, both to showing off what is done well and supporting that, and also to identifying where improvements can be made and actively moving towards an increasingly net positive impact for the sourcing of frankincense and other botanicals. And our theory of change on this is that the role of businesses like FairSource and like many other companies that operate in this space is really to support the communities and the harvesters who are directly responsible for managing the frankincense trees. At the end of the day, it is the people who live with the trees, who live in these areas, who own them, who work with them, who harvest them day in and day out. They are the ones that are driving landscape management, that are determining what happens with the species and with the ecosystems and with the practices in the wider supply chain, right? The people that are directly operating in the supply chain. They are the ones that matter and determine what practices are used. And it's our responsibility as businesses to support them, to make sure that they are in a stable place, that they have the resources that they need to be able to take a long-term sustainability-oriented view, and that they don't feel like they're under pressure to just try to make as much money as they can today because they're not sure what's going to happen tomorrow. At the same time, we want to be able to monitor what's happening in the supply chain. We want to see what are the social and environmental impacts that the supply chain is having. And by doing this, we can create a feedback and adaptive management cycle. We can put in management inputs, we can support the communities in various ways, and then see what happens. And if we're seeing positive improvements, we keep doing the same thing. If we see the opposite, then we go, hey, okay, we know that we need to change something up here. And by doing this, we can really create this positive feedback between all the different actors in the supply chain to create the kind of outcomes that we want to see. So the question is, how do we actually create this transparency and this accountability? If this is what we need to create positive change, how do we actually get it done? So first of all, the most important thing, I think, is that we need to create direct partnerships with harvesting communities. At the end of the day, supply chains are all about people. Management is a human endeavor, right? People determine what happens with the trees being harvested, with their ecosystems, with how people are treated throughout the supply chain. So social and environmental outcomes depend on what people see as the best strategy and the best way to take care of each other, take care of their businesses, and take care of their resources. At the end of the day, I think we all want the same thing, right? If we go and talk to harvesting communities, the feedback that we get from them is, of course, they want reliable income, they want to be treated fairly, they want to be respected, and they want to take good care of the trees that are under their care and the ecosystems that are under their care. We want the exact same thing. So we're all pushing towards the same objective, but we can't work together effectively unless we can actually get together, have direct communication, have dialogue, and be able to figure out challenges together and come up with solutions together. So creating those direct partnerships is really crucial. Now, certifications is a tool that has been used quite commonly to push towards responsible sourcing. You're probably familiar with labels like organic or fair trade. You might know some a little bit lesser known labels like Fair for Life, UEBT, Fairwild, certifications like that. All of these set standards of practice for how a supply chain should be operating. And the idea is that they set these standards and then they are assured by audits from third-party companies like EcoCert or Control Union. And if done correctly, this should increase the value for the products, right? You should be able to sell it at a higher price because you're showing that it's done ethically. And sometimes it just works perfectly like that. On the other hand, it's also important to remember there are many different certification standards. There are hundreds, and many of them don't fit well with a particular supply chain, right? So you could get a certification on a supply chain like Frankincense, say, but if the standard does not match well the needs on the ground and the realities on the ground, then it doesn't necessarily mean much, right? So you have to make sure it's the right certification for the job. The other thing is that the reality is that sometimes audits are not as high quality as they should be. And that's not necessarily anybody's fault. Many products come from very remote areas that are difficult to access, both geographically and politically. For frankincense, this is both. It grows in very remote areas. It grows in places like Somalia that are typically difficult for outside auditors to be able to access. And so it can be difficult for third-party audits to effectively see all the details they need to know for sure what's going on. Different certifications have different levels of consumer recognition as well. So sometimes people will pay more for it, sometimes they won't. But the cost of the certification itself can be significant. I mean, it can be tens of thousands of dollars a year to be able to get that stamp. And the question is, does that translate into positive developments on the ground and positive developments for the business or not? Now, some of these limitations can be addressed through technological solutions. And this is something that my company's been very excited about exploring. We have used mobile applications to document the supply chain, to document tree health and ecological health and social practices in a few different countries. We use a few different apps. And there's a lot to choose from. There are apps that are specifically designed to track supply chains, like TraceGains or InnoTrace. There's also apps that are not necessarily designed for supply chains per se, but that are great for collecting environmental, social, or spatial data and can be used to track supply chains. So there are things like Cyber Tracker or ArcGIS field maps. There are customized applications, sometimes that involve blockchain. And these different apps and different approaches are already being used in the field. So you can see a photo here of us collecting data using a custom blockchain-based mobile app that we developed for use in Somalia. And so this is in Puntland in Somalia. There are obviously strengths and weaknesses to this kind of approach. I think that the biggest strength and the thing that's most exciting is the fact that it really expands the data pool that you can pull in. So you can use multiple phones at the same time. You can use the app in multiple places at the same time. You can collect data throughout the year and even in very difficult to access areas. And when you collect data using this kind of approach, you get a time, date, and location stamp with the data, right? So you can say, okay, this piece of data was collected in this location at this time on this date. And you can get that information in real time. And so it really expands the pool of data that you have because you can see over time what kind of information is being logged, and you can pull in a lot more information throughout the supply chain. Now, on the other hand, it's also true that, as with all technology, it's garbage in, garbage out, right? If people are collecting data in a way that doesn't make sense, you're going to get conclusions that don't make sense. So it's really important to train personnel to effectively use any kind of data capture tool and effectively be able to follow any of these standards to make sure that you're getting good quality data. It's also true that when you use something like an app, it's not itself setting a standard like a certification, right? It's not holding the supply chain to any particular standard of practice. It's just showing what is happening. And that's where it's useful to pair data collection tools and distributed documentation tools like apps with things like certification standards or internal standards of practice to ensure that you have all the data to know that a standard is being met, and you have the standard to know that the data are showing something positive or not. It's also true that there is a bit of an economy of scale here, especially for customized applications. It can be expensive to develop tools, these tech tools. And so it often works a little bit better when you are dealing with larger amounts of resin or on larger scales. But once you get over that hurdle, technological solutions can be distributed almost at an infinite scale for a very reasonable price point. So it's a little bit different from certifications, which the cost of the certification is going to continuously expand. So technology can potentially help reduce the costs of certification and improve the visibility into the supply chain. It's important to remember that the systems and the tools that you use to approach supply chain risk should be driven by the level of risk and the desired outcome. So for instance, if you're sourcing lavender in France, that has a very different risk profile than frankincense from Somalia, right? Frankincense is higher risk socially and environmentally. And so you might say, hey, we need to deploy more tools to have a higher level of assurance that we're doing the right thing and that we're seeing the kind of outcomes we want in the supply chain. You might say, well, with something like lavender in a place like France, we're more confident that this is a safe situation, this is a stable situation, and so you might say, okay, we just need one thing. Maybe we just need one certification. Maybe we just need one tracking with an app and an internal standard, something of that nature. And so the tools you deploy really need to be determined by the individual supply chains, because of course, with every additional tool you deploy, you get increased cost and increased complexity. And so it should be tailored to the situation depending on how risky it might be. Now, in the course of deploying these tools and working in these supply chains, we've learned a few different things that I'd like to share. First of all, technological tools definitely improve monitoring. We've gotten a lot of great data from the use of these distributed documentation tools in a way that we really could not effectively get otherwise. When we think about the different motivations of companies, reducing the risk is approximately the same as improving social and environmental outcomes, right? If you improve social practices and ecological practices, you almost inherently get reduced regulatory and reputational risk. And so those two things really go hand in hand. But this is only possible when you have long-term partnerships and deep partnerships throughout your supply chain. And I say that it should be deep partnerships between your downstream partners, like your clients, and your upstream partners, like harvesting communities. People throughout the supply chain, the entities throughout the supply chain really should be aligned and should have good communication so that you can effectively address challenges together. Now, when you're working on this, it's important to remember that, of course, everybody wants to do the right thing, right? Everybody wants to see positive social and environmental outcomes. But at the end of the day, you also have to have it make sense on a business level. So the quality spec has to be right. It has to be top quality. The price point has to be reasonable. I mean, again, most people want to see positive effects, but if it's going to cost 5 times going market rate, that's very, very difficult for most people or most companies to meet, right? So pricing has to be reasonable. And it also has to be relatively low headache. Most companies and most sourcing personnel are dealing with multiple different products. They don't necessarily have the bandwidth to get deep into the weeds on a very complex and complicated supply chain. And so solutions that are developed to deal with challenges in supply chains, like for frankincense, need to be relatively low headache and low hassle. They need to produce high quality products, and they need to be price competitive. And we see differing responses across the industry depending on where specifically a company sits. As a general statement, what we see is that smaller companies and those that are more consumer facing, so particularly brands that have a consumer perception to meet, they're more willing to be innovative, to look for finding positive social and environmental outcomes, and really push for positive, responsible change for supply chains. And they tend to be the early adopters. Larger companies typically have more complicated sourcing infrastructure. They don't change on a dime, but they still want to see responsible sourcing. They're primarily dealing with regulatory issues and avoiding challenges in the supply chain. So they're looking for risk mitigation. But again, these two things go hand in hand, risk mitigation and positive change. And so depending on who you're engaging and depending on what segments of the industry are coming together, you can kind of tailor the message and tailor the approach to what's most important to these different market segments. But I think at the end of the day, a lot of different companies want to see the same basic actions, the same basic outcomes, even if their concerns and their risk tolerance is a little bit different. So thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this. I'm happy to answer any further questions that you have on our supply chain efforts or on the supply chains in general. I'm very happy to go into more details. You have my email and my phone number here. Thank you.